We've all heard you are what you eat. Let's big picture first that and think you are what you consume. This opens us up to more than those tasty yum-yums we so secretly snack on. Now we're all-inclusive with our sensory system. The ears, fingers, nose, and eyes have it too. Everything we consume becomes a part of us and can consume us if we let it. Just like secondhand smoke can give you cancer, even if you've never smoked a cigarette. Even being secondhand exposed to toxicity can cause trauma and even retrain our brains in ways we may not be aware. Our character, integrity, ethics, morals, and personality can be slowly eroded and degraded with toxic ideas, attitudes, and the methodical and consistent belittling of others, dehumanizing others, while judging and categorizing, labeling other people, diminishing their struggles, if not having an all-out schadenfreude meltdown, delighting in the pain we aren't feeling. We all do this. Music, movies, TV shows, reality TV, social media, the comments section, the list goes on and on. In our DNA, our traits from our parents and ancestors, and maybe someone along the way we didn't expect. Our DNA determines everything from our physical appearance to genetic markers for disease or illness. Our DNA is a code we barely understand. There are environmental factors and substances that can somewhat alter our DNA if we consume them. Well, we're tracing back our personality DNA in this episode, continuing our human mathematical equation and peril of perspective themes, deconstructing our favorite entertainment media and how it makes us who we are, whether we know it or not, whether we want to admit that we're all big copycats or not, whether we want to admit this is deep inside us or not. It's deep in there. That's what she said. And welcome to the podcast. I used to be a person who didn't monitor what I consumed on any level. The old motto, if it feels good, do it. I also didn't put much thought into the things I thought, said, felt, or believed. Not the way I do now. What I know is that I'm a guy who, I hope, has come a long way regarding how he views others and coexists in this world with others. Part of this painfully difficult journey of figuring out who we are comes with accepting who we are as individuals, at our foundation. And that starts with finding out what we are and admitting that to ourselves, and then getting to the root of why we are whatever that is. It's deconstruction, tearing it all down to build it back up again in a way that makes sense for you. But a part of this also is dropping the facade of socially acceptable bullshit we insist to persist to carry around. And when I say socially acceptable, I mean toxicity that hasn't quite worked its way out of our culture yet, but somehow is socially acceptable enough to pass without enough folks standing up to it, until they do. From Black Lives Matter to #MeToo, these important movements are rapidly changing our social geography, like the crashing of the tectonic plates of Pangea. The only issue is, well, they shouldn't be. We shouldn't have to have these movements, but we do. Why we do comes down to a culture of cultism, the same culture of cultism analyzing throughout this show. Still, times they are a-changin'. The world my daughters will be left, and their children will look drastically different than my own. One way or the other. It's that these movements are brought on by groups of people who feel united under the boot of oppression. Whether it's breaking down white supremacy in America and the institutions, organizations, and systems in place that further that agenda, or dismantling the patriarchy so that no woman ever has to miss out on an opportunity because she wouldn't show a little more thigh in the staff meetings. Fights for human, civil, and social rights are at the forefront of America's political battlefield. Now, whether you stand with, against, or otherwise on the fence about these movements, organizations, and the people, the current social climate is reflective of the idea that enough is enough. It's the 21st century, and it's time to move beyond some of the harmful and toxic ideas and ideals American society has tolerated for far too long. But why have we tolerated them at all? With a trend in what I'm calling the dumbing down and numbing down of American society, our populace is less intellectually equipped to critically think their way out of a wet paper bag, and too emotionally stunted to care if they get out of that bag or not. Heck, I'd argue most are so immersed in their phones, they've got no idea they're even in a bag at all. Our emotional intelligence is matching our intellectual intelligence collectively as a society. And I credit the most of that devolutionary erosion of our standards to entertainment media, social media, and corporate infotainment media, the latter two of which will be covered in upcoming episodes. I discussed it in the previous episode, The New World Order of Ethical Ambiguity, that professional wrestling could shoulder at least some of the blame for our current societal ethical erosion. While some of that was intended tongue-in-cheek more than satire, the fact remains that professional wrestling is both interwoven in our social pop culture fabric unlike any other sport and has been historically problematic on many levels. I discussed the harmful stereotype tropes that displayed for audiences for decades with no context or accurate diverse depictions. Adding fuel to that fire, as I explained, is the wrestling principle of kayfabe, which means to take their soap opera drama storylines so seriously they never even admit to the fans that it's just a show, skewing those lines of believability and objectivity, not for all, but certainly for some. That isn't just professional wrestling. It's slowly become all entertainment media. Our news channels mix editorializing with journalism and won't tell you the difference until they're on a witness stand under oath. Social media, the comments section, opens the doors for anyone to say anything in some Wild West free-for-all. It isn't Hollywood or liberal anything, it's simply the evolution of pushing the bar. How real do we want to show people? We get bored easily with the same old, same old. Eventually we crave more. Whatever it is. Just like Lucy and Ricky Ricardo pushing the beds together, now everybody has sex on network television. Before that, sex was something everyone hinted at or understood because a character had a baby, and that, as bad as we want to do it, Mom and Dad only did it once per sibling, and we just don't talk about it. Don't talk about doing it. Don't talk about anything about it. You might see a steamy yet clothed sex scene in a daytime drama, but it wasn't anything like today. Even the Flintstones slept in separate beds. Cartoons! But if they can touch going to sleep, well, brown chicken, brown cow, my friends. I've discussed in previous episodes that from conservative traditionalist perspectives, Ellen DeGeneres blasted open the doors of gayatudinosity for every homophobe out there and validated every toxic, ignorant, and fearful attitude that's come out since she announced she was gay over that airport speaker in late April 1997. On network television, we finally had gay in a way we had never had before. Now, we had gay before, but in a very controlled and slowly allowed box. The 1980s could have been transformative for the LGBTQ community if Ronald Reagan had chosen compassion and humanity and hadn't basically ignored the AIDS epidemic, effectively sort of second-hand murdering countless people with his inept and deliberately corrupt response. Now, from Reagan's perspective, he really didn't like homosexuals or African Americans and probably prayed for a plague of some sort to wipe these groups from his America. So when said plague did come, why would Ronald Reagan fight it when it primarily affected groups of people Ronald Reagan didn't even think deserved to exist in the first place? Entire groups of people, former president and Republican icon Ronald Reagan didn't even see as humans. So see, sometimes inaction is simply due to the corruption of the soul, not necessarily just corrupt governing. Forces in our society have held certain realities at bay, or at arm's length when they could no longer all-out ban the things from the public. Then, as art begins to imitate life, our boundaries shift, our standards lower or adjust, and our tolerance or acceptability for some ideas evolves. Or it doesn't. The point is, things will change. And as those things change, a prepared people will be able to handle those changes better. A people who are disregarded as worker bee profit engines won't adjust as well. Professional wrestling and many cheating scandals from the top athletes in their respective sports, from Pete Rose and the McGuire, Bond, Sosa, Canseco steroid scandal, and baseball, the many cheating scandals by the New England Patriots and those who came out of that organization, in football, the Olympics, Lance Armstrong, college football. These compromises on our competitive character eroded America's sportsmanship and competition ethics. How far we would all go to be winners, to be anything but a loser. But our ethics have been slowly lowered by one specific character trope in modern entertainment media more than any other. One we will discuss in the next episode a little more: the anti-hero. As I mentioned in the last episode about Hulk Hogan's status as a patriotic and Christian all-American icon, and his fall into narcissism and becoming a bad guy, joining the New World Order and ending Hulkamania as we knew it, would cement a theme in pop culture of our biggest heroes being drastically flawed, if not altogether self-serving. Think of other anti-heroes throughout just television history. Movies are another animal, books too. Television really was a clockwork orange in our living rooms, bedrooms, everywhere. It was brain training on weekly, regularly scheduled programming, appointment viewing, must-see TV, Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on NBC, TGIF on Fridays, ABC, and then a bunch of shows for 70-year-olds on CBS. Many of the characters in shows we all grew up on were clearly for entertainment purposes only, sure, but the themes and characteristics they normalized left lasting impacts on ourselves as well as society as a whole. Iconic television shows from Seinfeld to Saved by the Bell to The Simpsons to South Park and The Office, just for example. These staples of Generation X and after, the binge-watched background noise, even now, in light of some tweaking to our social norms, they look pretty toxic. Few sitcoms entertain me and make me cringe more than the American version of The Office. I'm not alone. I love The Office. But from a different perspective, that show either represented a norm in many workplaces enough to satirize it, or it normalized a lot of bad behavior in the workplace. It's a valid argument that a show like that could have just as easily raised someone's awareness of inappropriate workplace behavior and empowered them to speak out against their bad boss. There's at least the trade-off that some people saw that and felt validated that their behavior wasn't as toxic or unprofessional because at least it wasn't that bad. There's an even greater likelihood that the normalization of that sort of behavior in our society could lower the standards in the work environments where employees would naturally discuss their favorite moments, water cooler talk, break room chatter, just like on The Office. But when one starts allowing certain things to exist in certain spheres, it becomes a slippery slope we can't control. The themes of The Office were ridiculous, and it's hard to imagine anyone would get any work done in that atmosphere. Well, it isn't. If I'm being honest, almost everywhere I've ever worked was reflective of Dunder Mifflin. Art imitating life, or life imitating art. Chicken and egg. The characters on the show were charming and multidimensional for a sitcom. Credit to the actors and the writers. The show really had you caring about characters you didn't often see outside of that office setting. But many of those characters were mean, toxic, catty, and really narcissistic. Some were all-out sociopaths. Look, entertainment has to entertain. It has to tell a relatable story, often through caricatures of real people or easy-to-consume, superficial dimensional characters. Even if they aren't one-dimensional, we only get to see and know this little sliver of their lives. That's the nature of storytelling, of course. It isn't that they're telling these stories that's entirely the problem. It's that in order to enjoy the thing, we limit our perspective when consuming it. It's almost like we go on autopilot, shutting down the unnecessary stuff and, while we relax. We don't want to think about stuff too much. Who wants to overthink everything? Well, from another perspective of shows like The Office, Jim's a predator. Michael and Dwight, problematic at best, probably sued or arrested for something, certainly not employed, and if so, definitely not in any kind of leadership position. We won't even get into Ryan, Jan, Andy, Angela, or Kelly Kapoor. And Saved by the Bell, a kids show for teens? Zach Morris's trash is an actual YouTube feature, and he was. And guess what? He influenced me and a lot of young men in the 80s and 90s, whether we want to admit it or not. Who didn't want to be Zach Morris? Who hasn't found themselves saying or doing something you saw in a character or a TV show say or do, or wear, or think, or believe? So when we talk about perspective, continuing the Parallel Perspective episodes thing, we're talking about two things. Obtaining perspective, which is the first step. Then perspective from the standpoint of your own individual psychological point of view in how you see the world. For my previous example of the TV shows, if you don't get what I'm talking about, I might suggest you immerse yourself in the company of females for the purpose of learning and not scoring. On the surface, Jim looks determined to get the girl he fell in love with. And the girl, who by all accounts had similar feelings for him. Except that the girl was taken and he kind of interfered with not only Pam's life, but Roy's. He caused a huge distraction in the workplace and issues in a workplace setting that ultimately he got the girl. But what if he hadn't? That story looks way different. And I know it's just a TV show, but I've seen this play out over and over in real life. I've been Jim and Pam and Roy and Michael, a little Dwight. Mostly I think I'm somewhere between Creed and Stanley, but bygones. I know you're wondering if I'm going to overthink every one of your favorite TV shows, probably. Overthinking everything, after all. I'll offer this. Reflecting is healthy. Doing so pragmatically is essential. The only way we improve and get better, we must question ourselves. Often television, wrestling with our previous episode, or any other media, we find a character we relate to somehow, and that's who we latch onto in the story. But we rarely take pause to consider why we relate to that character or the story. Most of us may come to embody some of those traits, imitating those characters we find so appealing, consciously or not, even if it's just a catchphrase or mannerism. If this sounds like an overly sensitive guilt trip for liking pop culture icons and being a fan of something, I apologize. I'm not saying you can't enjoy The Office or Saved by the Bell or Seinfeld or even pro wrestling, or even that we should cancel them. Just like my previous episode on cancel culture, cancel culture can be a cancer culture if you just cut things out that bother us and then you don't have those hard talks about why they were there in the first place. I'm arguing for a higher sense of personal responsibility in media consumption. That begins with education and training your brain to discern better fact from fiction. That seems simple enough. Just look around. Is it? I'm saying that being aware of the weaknesses and flaws of these characters and the stories they present keeps us in check. It doesn't have to poo-poo on our love for the thing just to be aware. The line of reality becomes blurred all too easily when we, the people, go all gladiator sport with our fandom and devolve into cultism for these things that don't really matter. We begin altering our personality and the values to fit the thing we like, rather than asking if the thing fits in with the values we spent more than 6 seasons developing. And we currently don't do a great job of that, checking our own weaknesses and flaws so that we aren't so easily influenced by things like music, movies, video games, social media, TV shows, religions, politicians. I mean, if you don't check yourself on let's say, Darth Vader. I've spoken about him in previous episodes, talking about how people pick their cool characters without a lot of thought into what it says about them. Darth Vader, not Big Van Vader the wrestler. Both were big, imposing, dark, and had cool voices, seemed powerful. Let's stick with the Sith Lord on this one. He's a main character marketing the Star Wars stories and has for nearly 5 decades. While one of the coolest villains when I was growing up, I didn't like Darth Vader. He was blinded by emotions and sucked into a cult. He was a brutal murderer, a religious zealot on full-on psychopath, a literal baby killer. Look, I don't like people either, but I'm not going to blow up a whole planet just to make my damn point, okay? Han Solo? Unconventionally handsome, ethically questionable, morally ambiguous rogue? Now that's my style. An anti-hero for a new age. Child slaughter? Not really my thing. Still, Vader's big, dark, and cool, so, he must be the best character in the story, right? I know people who love Vader. Posters, tattoos, bumper stickers, shirts, merchandise galore. I have to ask, why? Is it the cool voice? Fancy red lightsaber? Is there something about Anakin's story arc that hits you personally? Or is it the servitude to a tyrannical empire, wielding limitless power and using it for evil, all while being a sheep to an old, wrinkled, washed-up wizard? What is it about Dexter that appeals to someone? It's a popular show to binge, and 6 out of the 7 original seasons are pretty good. The revival was good. But why would anyone relate to Dexter Morgan, a serial-killing sort of misguided moral police? You know people who do relate to Dexter, you know. Are they waiting with bated breath for him to get caught and for justice to finally be served? Or are they fascinated with the saran-wrapped justice being served and hoping Dex literally gets away with murder? Josh, it's just entertainment. A TV show. Is it? We're going to be talking a lot more about what we consume and how it affects us as Overthinking Everything grows, I assure you. This episode is sort of the lead into that little spin-off, if you will. What's confusing about this sudden shift to idolizing the villain as the hero is, I remember Darth Vader being a cool character growing up. I don't recall looking up to him. I wanted to be Luke or Han, or secretly Leia, maybe sometimes. Who wants to be Vader? Sociopaths. Psychopaths. Look, when you're kids, everybody has to take turns playing the bad guy. But somewhere between the late 70s and now, our society seems to have kicked the rebels to the curb and full-on embraced stormtroopers, Darth Vader, and an oppressive tyrannical empire. Our society has drifted to the dark side. Per our earlier episode, The Human Mathematical Equation, we know that we are the sum of all our parts. And if our parts are sprinkled with Darth Vader, Zach Morris, Jim Halpert, and Michael Scott, along with some really unhealthy ideas, stereotypes, and attitudes from, say, professional wrestling, well, sounds like a really funny Patrick Bateman. American Psycho for those of you playing the audio-only version of our game today. And if that's the perspective you choose in entertainment, how do we imagine that might affect your personality? Especially when most people are pretty one-note when it comes to entertainment. We aren't all that diverse in what we take in. Statistically, there isn't a lot of cross-viewer sharing between RuPaul's Drag Race or Queer Eye and WWE SmackDown or Duck Dynasty. So if we are at all influenced by the entertainment that we consume, that becomes one of the parts in our equation, one of our hats on our hat rack, one of those cellophane sheets of perspective I spoke about before. One of the most powerful lenses through which we will see our world around us. We are the sum of all our parts. I know for a fact that I am mathematically the sum of different personalities I've been exposed to over the years, many of those in entertainment. Are you willing to admit that? Is there anything about you, your style, manner of speaking, sense of humor, storytelling, body language, mannerisms, jokes? Is there anything you can think of about you that originated from something you listened to, watched, read, etc.? Have you ever had somebody say, "Oh, you remind me of so-and-so"? If it isn't coincidental physical appearance you can't help, well, it's likely you've been influenced by that actor or show in some way, or whatever. Some of those have influenced my own personality and style. Some came about and were written and performed in ways that related to who I already was. Seeing a piece of me being performed on screen. That's just how we as people relate to characters and then develop personalities. I don't get offended easily. I'm pretty self-aware and I try to be sensitive to others, especially with things I don't particularly understand. I suppose if I am intolerant of things, it's because I do understand them, and I'm sort of impatient with others who aren't with the program after all this time. Cups. Sensitivity and self-awareness. This is something with which therapy has helped tremendously. It's just that we must be aware of the overt toxicities these characters embody. We love these characters. We welcome them into our schedules, our homes, our lives, into our minds. And they are almost always flawed. So when we overlook those flaws in characters that we love, we begin to overlook those same flaws in people we love. And in ourselves. We become desensitized to the atrocity. So much so that we crave or seek out that confirmation bias that we aren't the worst person on the planet because South Park, It's Always Sunny, or Seinfeld. It makes us feel better about ourselves. What will we do to feel better about ourselves? Dehumanizing, desensitizing, numb, the numbing down of America. This is why diversity is so important in our communities and our individual circles. Obtaining perspective is the only way to achieve perspective. I don't know about you, but my journey has been an uncomfortable and painful shit show of epic proportions. And guess what? Most of it, my creation. Yeah, I certainly had some help pushing me in those directions. I want to get past this dismissive notion of thinking people are weak because they choose to behave like a human and think and feel. This bullying around that. It's the numbing down. So let's not talk about snowflakes or diminish others because they choose to see the world with more layers, through different perspectives, to be stronger in perspective, to not only wear more hats, but to strengthen the base of their human hat rack through constant lifelong learning and education. In fact, I find it pretty insulting when others don't honor perspective. At least accept that there might be a side you aren't seeing or can't really understand. How arrogant, not just selfish, flat out narcissistic to see things only from your point of view, to refuse to see things from anyone else's, as if they don't matter, as if they're lesser than. Isn't that more appalling? To literally walk through this world believing you are the center of the universe? Perspective. For a young man who felt powerless in his childhood and was raised mostly by a lower working class, problematic single dad with anger issues, maybe characters like the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, Dexter, and Darth Vader would have appealed to me. As a boy with low self-esteem and mommy and daddy issues, kind of always too insecure or anxiety-riddled to just go talk to the girl, maybe scheming and conniving to get the girl like Zach and Jim appealed to me. Don't give up. Try again. Don't take no for an answer. Manipulation is narcissistic behavior. Maybe Kurt Hennig's Mr. Perfect character's overcompensating arrogance and self-proclaimed perfection personified empowered my own cockiness to cover and overcompensate my own unsureness. Maybe a character like Shawn Michaels as the Heartbreak Kid appealed to me because I didn't always feel like a sexy boy, as badly as I always wanted to be a boy toy. Maybe the $1 Million Man made me see that everybody did have a price. And if I ever struck it rich, everybody's going to pay. Maybe some of those heels taught me that everybody's going to pay one way or another. And that winners do what it takes to win, so long as we aren't a loser. Maybe it wasn't just the heels. Crane kicked Danielson. Maybe as the guy who had always scored points for being the funny guy, sometimes even trying too hard for the laugh, maybe Michael Scott appealed to me a little too much, especially when coping with being sexually abused and harassed in a toxic and hostile work environment by a conservative Republican radio station owner who would later fire me for voting for Obama. Among other things, I'm sure. And look, if those are the only perspectives I take in, and I never do the work to flesh out why these toxic perspectives appeal to me, then when a narcissistic fascist comes around with very unsavory attitudes about women and, well, everyone I was taught and trained to have those same attitudes about, well, it might almost seem as if not only all of my abhorrent and deplorable ideas I was always made to feel guilty about having were finally validated, but it might also have seemed like one of my favorite reality TV caricatures just came to life to run for president. Perspective. The stage should have been set, folks. I should have been a Trumper. I watched his show. I didn't like him, but as a viewer of the show, a fan, I was certainly susceptible to the cultism of his personality. Even if I was appalled by his behavior and words, as I often was, even if I was amused, my defenses were lowered. Donald Trump was one of my cellophane sheets, I'm afraid. I already had years of those attitudes normalized and validated through my culture, and through my own self-fulfilling prophecies I've spoken about, those chips of unresolved trauma on my shoulder weighing me down. Well, I had those real-life encounters and experiences that I took all that in with, that I could use as reasons I had these toxic ideas. I've pretty much laid the foundation throughout the first half of this show that I'm a train wreck. I am the product of this toxic white Southern culture I'm deconstructing here. I hit checklists for numerous things, from being that school shooter kid to being that angry, entitled, sexist white guy in his 40s who's pissy when anyone else gets seen or heard besides him. And of course his "Don't Tread on Me" bumper sticker and license tag that he paid the state for. How did I avoid that? How did I not end up in the MAGA cult when every single stone was laid in my path paving that way? Well, this is the secret. The story that I think will change everyone's perspective on this rise of American fascism. It's simply that I survived Trumpism because unbelievable. The cards were stacked against me, in fact. And that's it. So take that story and you spread that message. It's like the scene from Independence Day. You now know how to defeat the alien. It's a virus. Just sneeze a big old hawker of truth in their face and they can't handle it. No? Are you kidding? That's the payoff. Why would I give you that story for free? Look, if I actually tell you that part, why would you buy the book? I'm not going to lie. I don't have a retirement. I am an actor. I did radio, then sales. This right here is all I got, people. Fine, greater good. But you're only getting a summary. First, my parents split up. Whose didn't? While that traumatized me greatly and more than I could ever measure, it also disrupted some traditionalism in my life that I believe was an early enabler of this deconstruction. Things like church, holidays, family routines, all of these things were sort of either clung to so desperately for some sense of normalcy or just seemed less important after the worlds blew up. Church was always a part of my life growing up. However, after my parents' divorce, I remember it was less a demand and more of a sporadic kind of if we can go. We didn't always have a church moving around the way we did. So it's entirely likely that had things been different and those routines, traditions, and foundations been more stable, I may never have seen through the ridiculousness of it all. I found none of that is as important as the things you create for yourself. Following a tradition just because Granny and Dad did it just wore off over time. Speaking of Dad, another key factor in this equation is my father's glass eye. More specifically to my father's disability, the disruption to generationally obligatory military service in my paternal line. I can't speak for everyone I grew up around, but mine was a raising of respecting the military. But my dad would hear of me enlisting. Oh no. His dad, my namesake, was in the Navy during the war before getting out and working on the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge National Laboratories, a post he would hold until retirement. My dad wasn't a company man, any more than he was the kind to fall in line and take orders. He loved those movies and characters, though. And I believe he always felt the disappointment with being excluded from the military, contact sports, athletics, because he lost his eye at 14. But because of that, he couldn't run and jump like the real boys. Pinocchio had to stay home or be the team manager. So not only was I raised with a respect for military service, I avoided the blind cultism behind it. I was raised to appreciate the job others did and then one I didn't want to do, but I wasn't raised with a bloodthirst in the idea that bullets, bombs, and drones solved problems. I also wasn't raised as an athlete. Dad couldn't play, and we moved around so much when I was young that by the time we settled down somewhere, all the kids who were good enough to play on teams, well, they'd been playing on teams for years. So I just played for fun. Those ideals of sportsmanship, leadership, teamwork, work ethic, competitiveness, I had to learn all of those other places, if I learned them at all. But just like with religion and military, I also avoided the blind cultism behind organized athletics. I've spoken about college as the single biggest factor in why I didn't devolve down the path of MAGA. Plain and simple. I stand by that. Change is a slow process, but it wouldn't have happened without the things I learned in class and out. The things I learned about people and myself. The things I experienced and saw others experience. The work, the struggle, the sacrifice. The payoff not being there in my bank account, but the payoff being there in my brain, where it mattered, where it made all the difference. Education wasn't my only source of enlightenment, nor was diversity. Unless, of course, you mean in substances I used. I found cannabis once I went off to college. I had been afraid of it before then. To be honest with you, I think I was afraid I'd be a burnout and get stuck in that town. That's probably a good and bad thing, but I know that when I began allowing nature to solve my body and mind struggles, things really started to fall into place. When I began doing so without shame, fear, or guilt, my life expanded as much as my mind. Diversity comes with transitioning from being a high guy to being a fun guy. Fun guy? Fun guy? Oh, fun guy. Fucking shrooms, man. Jesus. Okay, LSD too, lots of it, and I won't credit that for my personality shift, but I can't say that having whatever doors open in my mind like they were didn't help me get there. I do not advise it or recommend it. I am lucky, you will not be. It's fucking with the wiring of your brain, so don't. Therapy, do that. Do therapy. But I went down a downward spiral when I was younger, and I was quite self-destructive. Again, I was lucky, you won't be. I've spoken about my coming out of republicanism and my journey through religion, politics, and history. Earlier this season, I've laid all that groundwork. Go back and recap. But those experiences where the economy I was promised wasn't waiting for me when I got out of college, where the bust your ass and do what you're told and it'll pay off one day never paid off, where the good guys always seem to lose while the lazy, entitled rich guys or their friends or family always seem to have jobs and promotions and bonuses and big houses. Well, seeing these people who always put themselves on this pedestal of pride and piousness being exposed as unrepentant hypocrites over and over, and over, and over, and over again was certainly a factor. That experience in the workforce mirrored my experience in personal relationships with people. I was abused at home as a kid, then married an abuser, and then was abused again at home, and went to work and was abused wherever I went, it seemed. And all of that trauma built up and built up and built up. And having my eyes opened to that, and then learning about clinical terms like narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, and other mental health diagnoses and identifiers really made me see what I had been missing all along. Not only in myself, and not in myself, but in other people as well. I wasn't the crazy one. Oh, the light came on above my head, and it was a gaslight. In an upcoming episode, I'm laying out my story in the professional world. I'll be breaking down my journey through corporate culture and unraveling my own past mental breakdown, deconstructing my own downward spiral, and offering explanations to how this isn't just some isolated personality trait that pushed me over the line. This is a common, if not widespread, mental health epidemic that is present in millions of Americans, if not more. It all boils down to cultism. Somehow, I avoided cultism. I'm not really brand loyal, I never have been, just more brand familiar. I won't buy a Dell because I have to have a Dell. I'll buy a Dell because it's on sale, or I had one before and that computer ran okay. I'm Android over Apple, but I'm not culty about it. It's prejudice and preference. But religious cultism took a crack in the glass of that lens of perspective. I never had a military or athletic lens. No hunting, no racing, probably all due to that glass eye again. I was raised around guns, but I was always taught what they were. Killing machines. Mine was a different respect for them, an acknowledgement that they are for killing. And then seeing people try and deny that, it sends up a massive red flag for me psychologically. My father's glass eye is the reason I'm not in the MAGA cult, y'all. For all my father's toxic influence and all the deplorable attitudes and jokes he imparted on me, my father saved me from Trump. In a manner of speaking. Thanks, Dad. You created an open-minded, compassionate, progressive monster. Like some hillbilly mad scientist or Dr. Hankenstein. I've spoken all season long about some of those key catalyst moments that define us, and how my father's moment was losing his eye. That one event had such a lasting impact on him and me too. Ripple effects. It not only completely altered the trajectory of his life, but that one summer afternoon, 20 years before I was born, determined my habits, style, and personality. It determined my social standing, but also altered the very outcome of my very being. It dictated the life path of both of us. It dictated my father's trauma and would clear the path for my own, sometimes even replicating his in some sick, generationally fulfilled prophecy. My father's unresolved traumas regarding women and insecurities were passed down to me one way or the other. My father used me as a punching bag and a punchline bag. He'd hit me with a left smack to the back of the head and a right hook of misogyny. Because I was exposed to or didn't have certain ideas reinforced or hammered into my head the way others might have, I didn't pursue some of the activities and organizations that breed cultism. I avoided so many of the things I now see as traps laid to lure the vulnerable. I began, through my own journey of mental health, deconstruction and reconstruction, this rebirth of sorts. I started to uncover some common denominators amongst us all. one of which stood out among the rest. We're all a little crazy. There is no normal, except your normal. But your normal was likely established by someone else or something bigger before you even had the opportunity to decide for yourself. Now, part of this is civilization, the nature of being. We only know what we're taught, right? And we're taught some things so we can carry on that civilization. But who teaches us and what do they teach us? These are huge rhetorical questions that really are the beginning of deconstruction. Once we're willing to admit we were wrong, and willing to admit those we love may have been wrong, and admit that maybe what we think we know we probably don't, and that what we think we know is really minuscule in the universe's expanse of knowledge and information, and that those who taught what little we do know really didn't know all that much to begin with. I hate that I have to say this, but we all know someone who just thinks they know everything. And even if they say they don't, when it comes to espousing an opinion or a position, they sure have it all figured out, it seems. They stand so firm on that opinion, climbing that hill that they are willing to metaphorically die on, but literally kill for, with only a small fraction of an understanding on the topic or the various perspectives on that given issue. Dunning-Kruger, your table is now available. I'm unraveling this idea over the coming episodes that almost everything we know, say, and do comes down to a cultism that's been indoctrinated into us to the point that for so many, it risks rocking their foundation to its core to the point they may never recover if you unwind that. This deconstruction process is not easy, but it is worth it. What's resulted from this is a stronger validation through facts and data that my socioeconomic political philosophies are formed pragmatically and without self-serving interference. I'm always trying to think big picture first rather than having to step back to see the big picture. Less focus on self, more focus on us. We more than me. And that's hard. This journey has also strengthened my faith or spirituality. It's cost me a lot of the things that I grew up being told were important, but once I gave myself permission to let go of them, I found that things like tradition and someone else's misinterpretation of something they couldn't even begin to understand, it really stood in the way of my connection to this earth, this realm, and my spirit or deity, however you look at it. I began to connect with my past selves and my future selves in a way I cannot explain or even suggest you might try, but it's allowed me an understanding of others that I chose to explore here. But I had to spend a lot of time unraveling the twisted entanglement of toxicity that tied me down. Still working on it. These are knots tied and tightened over time, and the tighter they got, the more I was bound. The more you're held down, the more you reach for whatever feels good, however bad it may be for you. We're all bound, held down, my friends. I sound like some existentialist hippie guru or whatever, but it's like a light came on in my brain. And I began detaching from some things the way I once held as very important, even if it was just liking a TV show. I have friends who are so opinionated on things, and I kind of do have opinions on things, but usually those opinions are kind of laced around something deeper than which year's championship team would beat who, and which album was more successful than this one, and which movie should be remade into a series, blah, blah, blah. I love those conversations. They fuel a lot of creativity. They're also fun to examine in studying how strongly someone attaches to certain ideas. Ideas that, on the surface, don't matter. So I have to dig down deep and find out why that matters. Seeking their perspective, and offering a little compassion when you find out I haven't ever watched any of the Godfather movies. You hadn't seen The Godfather? Oh my God, you gotta watch The Godfather. I know, I'll watch it, I'm sure. But things like The Godfather cemented into our pop culture and extending into our overall societal culture as a whole. We see remnants of those ideas, memorable moments or quotes, characters, etc., living on in our personalities, mannerisms, and perspectives. Not to suggest that anyone watched The Godfather and it made them think, now this is the way the world should work. But you know some did. It's like I'm this big Christmas tree, since I love a metaphor. And I've been decorated with all these ornaments that I've collected along the way. Sure, they look pretty, but they can weigh me down just like the human hat rack. Those ornaments, pardon the pun, aren't just for show. Those shows, books, movies, songs, ideas, video games, everything we've taken in since birth contribute, if even just a little, to our overall personalities, further defining who we are, how we act and react, and even how we believe. But since the mid-90s, it's been different, very different. These morally mixed up, ethically ambiguous, character-clashing examples of integrity erosion that we have all mass-consumed mass quantities of, and exponentially more so over the course of this pre- and post-pandemic years, has bred a malignant malevolence in our manners and mindsets. We laugh and chortle as our standards are lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered until one day you have Ellen DeGeneres coming out as gay on primetime television. And now your daughter tells you that her best friend from college, who always wore pants to church, the only person who truly gets her, that she moved in with after they graduated to cut costs, is really her wife, and you weren't invited to the wedding 6 years ago because they always saw you sneer when anything remotely gay would cross your attention. They heard you say that AIDS was the gay plague, and how God sends things like that to wipe out atrocities. You know, like the flood. And oh my God, I can't tell you the things I heard growing up. But you see how, from a perspective that is very stunted and limited, they see it as they are the victims, not in an evolving world where they're sort of outdated, but that they're the victims in the rise of evil, sin, and some metaphysical decay on something dark side. In fact, it is that ideological oppressiveness and bullying and pandering that sort of propagates this patriarchal purity culture, pressure cooker explosion of steam, filling the room so much so that we all have to take off our shirts because of the humidity, of course, and not just don't move around too much, just maybe stand and just watch each other sweat in that steamy pressure cooker situation. We force people to believe, A, that there is a normal, and 2, that some of us ain't it, and that they, in fact, are the standard bearers of normal. But if you've ever trolled Craigslist, you know that isn't true. So growing up in this toxic white Southern culture where certain standards are insisted upon but never upheld, combined with corruption in that regard in areas of like local politics, business, church, seeing that this corruption was on an individual level, and that our overall culture was being sort of conditioned or gaslit with programming designed to make us addictive potatoes. Lots of money and research goes into figuring out what colors will trick your brain into thinking this or that. That's why many shows depicting some scenes from some areas use yellowish filters and others use bluish filters. Brain trickery. It's also true that there's a great deal of thought that goes into scripting even reality television so that you will keep watching just a little longer and grow that fandom into cultism. Cha-ching, baby! With professional sports selling out our standards of sportsmanship, competition, and fairness to some extent too, even our national pastimes are eroded with the corruption of greed. Our favorite players have no more loyalty than their owners, which is a really fucked up way to word that, but hey, isn't that what they say? The owner of this franchise? It's like some crowning achievement of elite royalty in America to be awarded a professional sports franchise. To be able to own an entire team of people. Again, I know, those players chose their fates and are compensated well. Considerably less well if you're a woman in professional sports, but are we ready for that conversation yet? Professional sports entertainment, as it's come to be, further corrupted our culture with the gladiator spectacle of professional wrestling. Who among us can say that they can't think of one pop culture reference tied to pro wrestling? I can tell you lots of stereotypes have been reinforced on that audience, further indoctrinating a culture with cultism tied to some very problematic ideas that most in that audience weren't trained to differentiate. These morally mixed up, ethically ambiguous, character-clashing examples of integrity erosion that we've all consumed mass quantities of, and exponentially more so over the course of this pre- and post-pandemic years, has bred a malignant malevolence in our manners and mindsets. We laugh and chortle as our standards are lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered until one day, America's hero and the very epitome of the all-American Christian good guy, Hulk Hogan, had the chokehold on Hulkamania just a little too tightly, a little too long. His shtick, like all shticks, eventually gets boring. Plus his contract ran out. And America wanted characters like the mysterious Undertaker and the narcissistic misogynist Shawn Michaels to lead the next generation. Hulk changed his name to Hollywood, increased his profit margin a little, and then flipped heel, turned bad, and every wrestling fan had to wrestle with this conflict of what we had all grown up with. This very Reagan-era patriotic caricature of a hero falling from probably the highest American athletics pop culture pedestal. Hogan wasn't the first American icon to disappoint an audience. He wouldn't be the last. But with Hogan's fall to self-serving, win-at-all-costs, questionable loyalty coming in the summer of 1996, then, within a year, Ellen comes out as gay on television and the doors of what was acceptable on TV are blown off the hinges. Then in 1998, Google is founded and the FDA approves Viagra. Oh yeah, and the Bill Clinton intern scandal broke. The following year, America would unveil its first real television anti-hero. An anti-hero so anti-hero that this show could only be on premium subscription channels. And before those were like everything. Tony Soprano would debut. And while I didn't watch The Sopranos until much later after lead actor James Gandolfini passed away, that show's impact on our pop culture is undeniable. In fact, this one show might shoulder similar responsibility as professional wrestling for its normalization of, well, these morally mixed up, ethically ambiguous, character-clashing examples of integrity erosion that we've all consumed mass quantities of, and exponentially more so over the course of the pre- and post-pandemic years, has bred a malignant malevolence in our manners and our mindsets. We laugh and chortle as our standards are lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered until one day you find yourself trapped at home, unable to leave, bored out of your ever-loving mind, binge-watching shows you grew up with, shows you missed the first time around, those shows you always wanted to watch but never quite made it past episode 3. And those evergreen classics you just watch over and over and over and over and over again. While shows like All in the Family, The Office, Saved by the Bell, South Park, Dexter, Seinfeld, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and characters we love to hate and hate to love like Darth Vader or J.R. Ewing, can certainly skew the lines of our standards, our norms, and our mores. And then those pivotal cultural shift moments in entertainment, like those sitcom beds being pushed together for the first time, going where no man had gone before with TV's first interracial kiss. A clearly gay woman having the nerve of actually saying she is gay on her own television show where she plays a character based on her. These are just a few examples of a much, much, much bigger picture. I'm not arguing these shows and their groundbreaking depictions shouldn't have happened. It's that they shouldn't have been groundbreaking at all. It's the fact that before Star Trek, America was too afraid to see a white and black partner touching lips on television. It's that before Ellen there were gay characters, but now there was a whole gay show. It's that so long as we keep the beds apart, people won't think about sex. And thinking about sex, that drives people to sin. Well, not talking about sex makes it so that we want to talk about sex more, and we don't, and then really bad things happen. So really, maybe we should have normalized a lot of this stuff a long time ago, but because of the very people who get upset when these pivotal moments arise, we have friction. We're only at Black Lives Matter and hashtag Me Too or Time's Up because these horrific standards were put in place and upheld for so long and far too long. And those horrific standards are in place at least at some fault to our culture and our pop culture. But mostly at fault is we the people. We aren't very good at regulating garbage in, garbage out. In our strive for real and authentic, we've sold our souls and cashed in all of our credit for self-serving, endorphin-releasing addiction to the feel-good because overthinking everything doesn't always feel good. In fact, it hurts. It's a shameful and a humbling experience, if not humiliating exercise, one that sees us admitting that we took a lot of things way too seriously, and it bled over and into aspects of our lives and maybe even beliefs. After all, if Hulk Hogan could go bad, why am I playing by the rules? Even Hulkster, all right? Hollywood said that doesn't matter. So when you're left with a collage of corruption and a chasm of character with no further thought into what we consume, much less whether we're offering ourselves a balance, we risk falling prey to cultism. When we start to look at our human hat rack as that Christmas tree, those ornaments of all these characters, shows, and ideas we pick up along the way, we see that they decorate our personalities and our entire manners of being, sometimes so much that it weighs down our branches, weighs down one side of us, tips us over, and we don't often consider the volatile chemical reactions some of those ideas might create when we mix them inside our untrained brains. If you strapped us into a chair, a Clockwork Orange style, and force-fed us toxic and dehumanizing depictions, ethically ambiguous, morally misaligned anti-heroes, imagine what we will be when you loosen those binds and send us out in the world. We are the sum of all our parts, after all. And if most of those parts are, well, these morally mixed up, ethically ambiguous, character-clashing examples of integrity erosion that we've all consumed mass quantities of, and exponentially more so over the course of the pre- and post-pandemic years, has bred a malignant malevolence in our manners and mindsets. We laugh and chortle as our standards are lowered and 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 lowered until one day a self-proclaimed wealthy reality show star who would never show you his financials and asked Russia to hack an American election live on television, and who said he wanted to have sex with his own biological daughter, drew large, enthusiastic crowds at rallies where he mocked disabled reporters, every marginalized community one could think of, while paying people from those marginalized communities to wear his gear behind him on television, denigrating and sexualizing women, bragging about grabbing them by the genitals, might seem like a dream come true for some Americans who always felt uncomfortable with some presidents dressing nicer, talking nicer, being smarter, and, well, better than them. Now, what number do I call to vote for the contestant? The dumbing down and numbing down of our society. It didn't begin in 2016 with the narcissist conning the uneducated and frothing at the mouth angry masses, I'm afraid. That was the result. In fact, it began nearly 20 years prior, maybe even before. But one factor opened the door for all of that, and it wasn't Hulkamania, brother. It was the real New World Order. It was the actual creation of the New World Order, which we'll be discussing in the upcoming episode. This one piece of legislation laid the groundwork for the Donald Trump presidency. Coming up, I'm overthinking everything about one of the most influential periods in the modern era, and the one that directly resulted not only in the MAGA movement, but the rise of misinformation, social media, and the current discourse and division in America. In fact, I've discussed part of this before, but we're going pre-9/11 in my analysis in what swept the leg out from under American ethics and deeper morality. I'm breaking down one piece of legislation that made no sense except to the rich people it benefited and the masses it converted to extremism. This one bill that sold our souls and cleared the way for all our information to be available to the highest bidder. If yeast needs sugar to feed on, then fascism was the yeast. It's feeding on the sugary sweetness of cultism. And I'm going to tell you how we got to this point where our democracy truly is in danger, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music under my Sir Talks A Lot handle, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, my clips of acting and voiceover work I've done over the years. It's all organized in separate playlists for your convenience. Check out my merch store, get all your trigger gear, and make sure you follow me on TikTok, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And if you like what I'm talking about, go to my website at jbvo.me and fill out that form. If you like this series, do all the things I need you to do and maybe drop a little dime on Cash App. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.